This is Greg Canty here, and welcome to the Win Happy podcast. Stay tuned for interesting chats with interesting people about winning their lives and being happy at the same time. This show has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. Thanks for listening. On today's podcast, I welcome back Paul Niland of Lifeline Ukraine, who's been living in Kyiv for the last 20 years. Paul gives us a fresh update about life in Ukraine, his assessment of the progress against Putin's forces, and the international help that is needed to end this war for once and for all. There is no doubt about the resolve of Ukraine, and that victory is guaranteed. It is just a question of time. Paul also chats about Christmas and the decision of cities that have suffered huge losses to go ahead and put up their Christmas trees. We won't let Putin rob our children of Christmas. Glory to Ukraine. To all of my loyal listeners, have a very special Christmas and enjoy that well-earned holiday. Thank you sincerely for your time. Paul Niland, a huge welcome back to the Win Happy podcast.
It's always a pleasure to have a chat with you, Greg, and thank you for inviting me back.
It's the third time we've spoken, and the first time was a Sunday in February 2022, a few days before the Russian invasion. And I'm not sure what you believed in your head, and we had a good conversation. I was asking what your prediction was about Putin, despite all the threats and everything else. And I think we weren't sure, and the unbelievable thing happened, the thing that we thought wouldn't happen. Of course, the thing that he wasn't expecting was the resistance from Ukraine. And we spoke again 100 days later. I'm sure that was on a Sunday as well. And at that point in time, you were predicting the Kherson pushback of the Russian forces. And we saw that pretty much 2 weeks after, I think you were predicting. And it was quite continuous after that. And would I be okay in saying that was a very particular phase of the war where there was huge momentum on the Ukrainian side? It was a big pushback, lots of positivity. We could see on our TV screens celebrations in Kherson. But now I think we've entered the revenge phase, whereby the cities in Ukraine are being pulverized again, just citizens and everything else.
So I remember back in February, before the all-out invasion, my feeling then was that we were going to see a big and bloody war in the east and the potential occupation of a land strip that would give Putin a bridge to occupied Crimea. And essentially, that's the position that has been fought back to now. That is the territory that is being fought over. I did not at the time think that Putin would be crazy enough to come for Kiev, right? I mean, this is a huge city of millions of people, you know. But on the 24th of February, when the all-out invasion began, that day I remember that the sound that I remember hearing the most that day was the sound of suitcase wheels as they, trip along the tiles, the footpath. And a lot of people fled for safety. I mean, there were explosions all over Kiev. And yeah, you're right. I mean, we've returned to that now since October the 10th, when there's been regular bombardments. It's either on a weekly basis or there's an 8-day, maybe 10-day break between those attacks. And those attacks predominantly have been against, what is critical infrastructure. It's against the energy power grid. And that's not an act of revenge from Putin's side for the liberation of Kherson. And you're absolutely right to comment on the joyous scenes. That was the only major regional capital that Putin had taken in this phase of the war. But when it was liberated, the first two reporters who got in there, one from Sky News and Nick Robertson from CNN, what they captured was undeniable joy. I mean, people who had been under occupation for, at that point, 8 months, and been subjected to miserable treatment by the occupiers. And when I say miserable treatment, I mean, constantly living in fear if you had a pro-Ukrainian, an openly pro-Ukrainian position, and, people being taken away and tortured. One of the torture chambers that they found actually in Kherson was specifically for children, for minors, for people under 18 years of age. That's how the Russians operate. everywhere that they occupy. And so, Russia's strategy right now is to try to break the will of the Ukrainian people and do so by plunging us into long periods of darkness or having no heat or having no water or whatever. But it does not work. Like the attitude of the people of Ukraine to each one of these attacks is that it just makes us all more determined to bring this to an end, and bring it to an end we will.
For the last few weeks here, we've had biting cold, which is something we haven't experienced in a number of years in Ireland, except we've had the benefit of having electricity and our heat working and everything else through that time. I think that's pretty much the situation in Ukraine now, isn't it? That's where the temperatures are. Is it 0 or is it below 0 at the moment?
Probably around -5 today, something like that. It got down to -10 last week. The wind chill factor on top of that, but those are the conditions that we're used to.
Yeah,
we always have a cold winter here, and this is now my 20th winter in Ukraine. And my son came last year for New Year's, and I bought him a ticket on one of these low cost airlines where you have to pay extra for the checked luggage. And so I said to my ex-wife, I'm like, he can just come up with like a backpack filled with his personal things that he needs. And she's like, he can't come to Kiev without winter clothes. I said, I've got everything, and 2 times more than I need. Like, I mean, we're prepared. We have hats, we have scarves, we have gloves. I have a big down jacket that I've been wearing through the coldest of times. And the last strike that came in took out heating facilities, but today the mayor of Kiev, the former world boxing champion Klitschko, he announced that all of the heating has now been repaired. Everything is now back online. And so, what the Russians throw at us, of course, it is deadly. It is deadly. There was a missile that hit a building in the city of Kryvyi Rog a couple of days ago, and as well as a 64-year-old woman, there was a husband and wife who were killed. And when the initial reports came out, they were still looking for their baby son. And then when they finally reached him under the rubble, they found that he was also dead. The boy was 1.5 years old. What they're doing is, Russia is a terrorist state. Their intent is to terrorize the people of Ukraine. And again, it just makes the fighting that's going on, it is existential. It is a fight for the existence of Ukraine as a country. And yes, what they wanted to do on the 24th of February. There's a very, very long read in the New York Times that came out yesterday. It's a good hour's worth of reading. But they seriously thought that they would be able to fight their way to the center of the capital of Ukraine in the space of a couple of days. They packed dress uniforms and medals to have a parade down the main street in the center of this city. And I, like the rest of us who stayed here throughout that early phase, I was disgusted that they would have the arrogance to think that they could come and take this city. But they did. They believed their own propaganda about having created this, this great and all-powerful army. And ultimately, one of the things that's undermined it is the main problem in Russia itself, and that is corruption, right? So while there's billions and billions and tens of billions being spent on theoretically modernizing the army, in actual fact, it was getting siphoned off. There's one story, for example, about phantom soldiers, where there's a bunch of soldiers who are on the pay books, but they don't actually exist. One of the funniest stories, actually, is that apparently the FSB, the renamed KGB, since the end of Soviet times, the FSB had been given a slush fund of $5 billion to fund collaborators that would assist the Russian army when they came in, when they invaded. But, the FSB being what the FSB is, the generals had stolen all the money and bought up luxury properties in Dubai and places like that, And I mean, fundamentally, that's what's wrong with Russia. That's what Putin is fighting to maintain as well. It's that corrupt system that he sits at the top of. And that is what Ukraine in the Revolution of Dignity in 2013, 2014, that's what Ukraine stood up against. And we will never go back to that. And we will never go back to being part of some Russian empire or anything like that, or being again occupied and controlled by Moscow. But the existential fight from the Russian perspective is not for necessarily the Russian state itself, but it's for that corrupt system that is Putinism.
I'm not sure if you heard it. I was listening to a podcast this week. It was on the New York, The Daily, and one of their reporters was in Russia, and she was basically overseeing a whole bunch of conscripts jumping onto their buses, heading off, and they were there with their loved ones, kissing and hugging them and all that kind of thing. And she, obviously, they didn't want reporters in there, but she did manage to talk to one or two of them, and she managed to talk to some of the women as well. And the consistent story that seemed to be coming from her reporting was a bunch of conscripts, all shapes and sizes, who were more than surprised to be called up, abandoning their careers, lives, whatever they are. But they had no idea why. They had no clear understanding of what this whole thing was about. That's neither the men who were going to fight or the women. And I was thinking to myself, and I was obviously thinking about our conversation today, and regardless of the reasons, that's a bunch of men who are obviously going to be trained in a very, very bad way. They're going to be put through some awful circumstances. They're being fed to the slaughter by Putin stupidly, but they're doing it for the love of their country and whatever bullshit that they've consumed. And it's clear that they're going to get some battle with the Ukraine forces. And the legacy of all of that is going to be whatever about the hatred that's there now. God Almighty. You know, we think about Ireland and Northern Ireland and how that kind of chaos continued forever. What sort of a legacy is this going to leave behind? You know, a lot of those men are obviously going to die, and on the other side, they'll figure out eventually, hopefully, exactly why they were in this stupid fight. What's it going to do to those two countries and those two peoples? You know, we roll the clock forward 10 years, 20 years.
It's going to take more than 10 years or 20 years for the Ukrainian people to even think about forgiving Russia for what they've done. And it's going to take some period of time as well for the Russians themselves to realize not only what they've done, but what they've become. And I wrote an article for Byline Times about 3 months ago. And in it, I argued that war is an unnatural state unless you're Russian. Because if you're Russian, as long as Vladimir Putin has been in power, all you've known has been wars. In actual fact, he created the circumstances for the Second Chechen War in order to boost his popularity. And when I say created the circumstances, we're talking about the apartment bombings that happened in various cities, the first two in Moscow, and then was it in Krasnodar, and then the fourth bomb that didn't go off in Ryazan. You know, hundreds of Russian citizens were killed so that Putin could blame the Chechens and go in and have this war, which is what ultimately thrust him into the presidency, right? You know, and the way that the Russian army acted with the destruction of Grozny, you know, it was ruthless. And the people of Russia seem to cheer that on and support it. And this is how, you know, they've now developed that through the 2008 war that bit chunks off Georgia, and then through the involvement in Syria, where, you know, civilians were slaughtered and aid convoys were targeted by Russian military jets, you know. And then the beginning of the war against Ukraine in 2014, where, you know, it wasn't just the taking of Crimea, but the creation of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics happened not in Donetsk and Lugansk, it happened in Moscow, right? They're entirely Kremlin-created and controlled non-entities. And I mean, another article that I wrote, this one's probably about 3 years ago, for the Kiev Post newspaper, I wrote the Kremlin's dirty secret is Gruz 200. And Gruz 200 is the code that's given for a vehicle that's carrying dead soldiers. And the article was about how the Russian state had been covering up their war losses in the Donbass. And I see now, you know, these men that are going off to war and their families. And I mean, you said that they don't really know why they're doing this, right? But when I see the complaints that come from Russia or the protests that are sporadic and few in number, it's only ever about their conditions. It's about their lack of training. It's about their lack of equipment. And so therefore the protests from their well-meaning wives and mothers and whatever else, the protests are basically these men are not being equipped well enough to go and kill Ukrainians.
to wreak
right?
devastation, yeah.
But the question should be, why the hell are we even waging this war in the first place? Like, I mean, as we talked about Kherson and the liberation of Kherson earlier on, none of these places, and I shared this question yesterday on Twitter as well. There was a video recording from the city of Mariupol from this time last year, from Christmas time last year, and it was their Christmas preparations. The lights were out, the tree was up, and I shared the video and I said, if you know someone in Russia, show them this video and ask them whether those people look like they needed liberating.
Yeah.
Because that's the nonsense that comes out of the Kremlin, that somehow these territories have been liberated. Well, the people of Kherson didn't ask for it, and the people of Mariupol didn't need it. Mariupol, when we finally get back to that city coming back under Ukrainian government control, what we're going to discover there, the level of slaughter. It's not just killing, Greg. It's slaughter on a mass scale of tens of thousands of people. For what? For what? For Putin to have this land bridge so that, issues with supplies to occupied Crimea aren't going to dog him going forward in years and years and years. Well, a wake-up call, Vladimir Vladimirovich. You're not going to keep Crimea. Crimea is Ukraine.
Yeah.
Crimea will be liberated. And President Zelensky was talking about this yesterday, in actual fact, saying, I want to be on a Crimean beach for my summer 2023 holiday. And there's lots of people who are talking the same way as well. I mean, the annexation, the theft of Crimea, people talk about it as if it was relatively bloodless because there's a high percentage of ethnic Russians who live there, probably what was wanted by the people resident there anyway. I'm sorry, that's bullshit too. That's bullshit too. If there was a genuine local desire amongst the residents of Crimea, Putin wouldn't have needed to falsify the referendum that he claimed to have carried out there. And then, what he's done in this phase of the war as well with referenda, again, in hanging air quotes, right? Referenda in Kherson and Zaporizhia that have also clearly been falsified. It just demonstrates that what he did in Crimea was falsified too. Like that's how he operates. And now he just does it on a grander and more evil scale. This brings me on to a very important point as well. There's a side of the debate which is that there should be a compromise, there should be peace talks. Let's freeze this war, stop this war. And if you look at what's occupied now, right, with the coastline of the Sea of Azov and parts of the east of the country as well, it's a recipe for a further invasion. If you look at occupied Crimea and occupied eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, that was the springboard that allowed Putin to join these dots, if you like, and to get to where he is right now. And if the war is paused, as some people think is the morally right kind of thing to do, you're imperiling the future of Ukraine because it's a springboard for an even bigger attack when Putin manages to regroup and conscript hundreds of thousands of more Russians and continue to poison their minds. What needs to happen, and it needs to happen actually for the good of Russia as well, is that Russia must be defeated and defeated militarily by Ukraine, and it must capitulate. And that humiliation for the Putin regime when it comes, hopefully that's going to bring him down. And I wrote, I'm sure you've got a bunch more questions you want to ask, but the first article that I wrote during this phase of the war said that what will inevitably be massive loss of life on the Russian side, right? And I was thinking it would be, tens of thousands, right? By Christmas, it will be 100,000 dead Russians. And I predicted that massive loss of life would cause an internal uprising within Russia. But so polluted are their minds that they're and polluted as in against the Ukrainian state, but also polluted in this gross mentality of war, constant war. It doesn't seem to have moved the needle. Like it's astonishing that we will pass by Christmas 100,000 dead Russians, and there's not 100,000 mothers and widowed wives out on the streets in Russia saying, stop this insanity. My son is dead. My husband is dead. The father of my children is dead. How they're not going out there and doing that, I mean, well, it speaks volumes about the Russian mindset, right?
Yeah, and as well as that 100,000 dead Russians, there's a lot of Russians who, well, according to a lot of the reports, who were sold a load of bullshit about Ukraine and why they were going in there, and now they've witnessed it for themselves. So at this point in time, there should be a big accumulation of real stories from the ground as to what they've experienced. And the whole thing was a load of horseshit, but surprisingly, exactly what you were saying, that penny isn't dropping at all. And it just seems to be going deeper and deeper. And that made me concerned about, is this now just, you're in a fight, you don't know who started or why there was a fight at all. All I know is that someone's shooting at me from the other side. So they're killing my brother and my friend and everything else. And so suddenly we're all in. Where's it going, Paul? The last time we were speaking, you had, that fantastic insight around Kherson. Where are we now, do you think? How do you read the situation?
So in the prelude to the question that you asked, you hit the nail on the head with one of the things that's absolutely wrong about the Russian military positioning. It's that they don't actually have a set goal. The set goal at the beginning was to take over the entire country, to replace our democratically elected government. There were even candidates who were proposed. It was ludicrous on the face of it, but that's really what they thought that they could do, and that they would have a placid Ukraine under their boots, essentially. And now the Russian military strategy seems to be to just hold on to whatever it is they've managed to gain, both since 2014 and since the 24th of February of this year. But the problem that they have, and again, that New York Times long piece that I read yesterday, it explains that, they took more land than they were capable of holding on to because of the overstretched resources. When Ukraine advanced into Kharkiv, it found that it was so lightly defended that's why we had this lightning advance. And it was pretty much 5 days of liberate the occupied parts of the entire oblast. Months ago, I remember asking the question on Twitter, and Lieutenant General Mark Hertling answered me. And I said, what is the chance that Russia can actually secure this territory that they've grabbed now? And Mark Hertling just answered 0. One word. And he was the commander of U.S. armed forces for all of Europe, right? I mean, he knows what he's talking about. If we look at another senior American military figure, General Ben Hodges, he's predicting, and again, in line with what President Zelensky said yesterday, he's predicting that the war itself, the active part of the fighting, will be done around the springtime, and that Ukraine will have retaken control over Crimea by the summer of next year. And the juxtaposition between the Russians not having a plan, right? I mean, how can you send a military to go to fulfill a set of undefined goals, right? They don't have the plan. They don't have the capacity. And the diametric opposite of that is what Ukraine has. What Ukraine has is a set goal, which is the liberation of all of our territory. Full stop. No compromise. Russians will not be allowed to sit on any part of what is internationally recognized to be Ukraine. And, a chap I'm proud to be friends with, I've known him for years, very, very successful businessman in agriculture. His name's Seva. And he was in Austria on the 24th of February. He's from Kharkiv. And on the 25th of February, he was back in Kharkiv and financing the establishment of the Kharkiv Territorial Defense. And I saw a video and I shared it and I said, known this guy for years, right? But it was him with his unit walking up to the Russian border, right? And literally there's a border post, there's a checkpoint, and he walks up to it and he says, this is our land. What's over there? We don't want it. This is where we stop. And then he literally put a stop sign in the no man's land in between the two. And that's what Seva has done in his native of Kharkiv, and another good friend of mine, Losha, another very successful businessman as well, from Donetsk, who relocated when the war began in 2014. Actually, let me tell you a little story. Losha's mum and dad used to live in a place just outside of Donetsk called Kramatorsk. And he'd bought them a new home on the outskirts of Kiev. And we went out there for a lunch one day. And my then wife, she said, do you think like this is your home forever now? Like, it's a beautiful house and et cetera, et cetera. And he said, I can't make that kind of prediction. He said, if you'd have told me that I wouldn't live the rest of my life in my beautiful home in Kramatorsk, I'd have said you were crazy. And it's when I talk to people from that part of the country, from the eastern part of the country, who never saw this coming, who never had any inkling that there could be war on their land, that again demonstrates, the entirely manufactured nature of this conflict. It wasn't a local uprising. Otherwise, my friends Losha and his father, they'd have known about it. They'd have heard the rumblings and known that something was coming, And Losha's dad has to be able to go back to his home in Kramatorsk. Losha should be able to go back to his home city of Donetsk and to reclaim the business assets that he owned there. They owned a brewery, they owned shopping malls, business centers. Ukraine's control must be returned to all Ukrainian territory, and all of Russia's wrongs must be righted.
Yeah, and you're so strong online. I see that with any conversations that you have, and any conversations about negotiating with anyone and trying to negotiate a peace. There's no negotiating with a terrorist.
There's no negotiating with a terrorist. And again, what the Peace Now movement kind of overlooks is that the people who are on territory that is occupied by Russia, they are subjected to horrendous conditions, including rape. I read something a few weeks back. It was a quote from somebody who is a UN investigator of war crimes. And what she was quoted as saying, get this. The Russian soldiers were actually being equipped with Viagra. Right? So, you think about a person violating somebody, man or a woman, and it's happening to both, but violating a person in such an evil way. And then you think about the gang rapes that people have been subjected to. And then you think about them extending that torture by taking Viagra. I mean, it's our third conversation, and we've been a little bit more sweary on this one, but it's fucking evil.
It's evil beyond belief, yeah.
And when people are saying there should be a negotiated settlement, there's one thing that they're saying is we will abandon a bunch of Ukrainian citizens to that fate, And the other thing that they seem to be saying as well is maybe Russia has some kind of legitimate call to some of these regions because they're Russian speaking or have ethnic Russian populations or whatever it might be. I'm sorry, no, they've bought absurd Russian lies to begin to arrive at that position. It must be reversed.
And I think part of that, let a negotiation happen. I think part of that conversation is because of the nuisance value of Russia invading Ukraine and this war that we talk about. Everything is more expensive here and it's inconvenient, and, there's all talk about us not having heat. If only that nuisance and that inconvenience could be waved away with a magic wand by someone having a convenient conversation. But it can't be convenient. It needs to be just trampled out.
But I've used the word evil a couple of times in this conversation. That is what the Putin regime is, right? And I sadly consume Russian propaganda to be able to understand it. And, they are seriously talking about London. They're talking about bombing Berlin. If Vladimir Putin is not stopped now, then he will go further.
Yeah. Oh, God. There's no doubt about that.
What we're doing, and again, I read a lot of military figures, and what Ukraine is doing right now is it is neutralizing the Russian army as a whole, right? And many believe that Russia's eventual defeat, and it is inevitable as well, will lead to the breakup of the Russian Federation as it stands today. And that's a matter for Russia and Russians to decide. But the dismantling of the military threat that exists from Russia, Ukraine is doing that. And that is to the benefit of the rest of the free and democratic world. And I mean, we talk about the cost of war. Lots of countries have provided huge amounts of aid to Ukraine. I mean, we need more. We need better weapons. We need a higher quantity of weapons. But for the dismantling of the Russian military machine, it has cost 5% of the United States annual military budget. It's a bargain. When you think about it in those terms, 5% of their budget, and the Russian army, the Ukrainian army, have destroyed the Russian army. That's why they're throwing in these conscripts, which they can't train and they can't equip.
Yeah,
because the vast bulk of what was Russia's fighting potential is no more. They have been killed.
And in a way, as you say, it was a cheap way to find out the extent of their capability, which isn't very deep, except for this big nuclear question.
I wrote an article on the nuclear question as well, and I mean, is there a threat of nuclear war? As long as nuclear weapons exist, of course, theoretically there's a threat, but we all learned. I guess you and I are probably around the same kind of age, but
we're both very young men, Paul.
I tell you, these last 10 months have aged me.
Can I tell you? And honestly, I didn't mean to say it when we got on. Yeah, I was going to say, you've aged. I don't know, maybe it's the haircut or something. And actually, your hair looks very nice, by the way. I'd say you went to the hairdresser recently, but I genuinely thought, Jesus, this man has aged.
Yeah, I have.
And God, why wouldn't you? How couldn't you?
I mean, you know what it is I do for a living, right? I run our National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and I had a meeting on Friday afternoon with our donors, and I was showing them some research that I'd done, and the number of Google searches within this country on the subject of mental health or requiring some kind of support. Like, I mean, the massive spike that came with the all-out invasion. And so there's one level where it's the collective trauma of us all, right? Because everybody in some way or another, from my perspective, I mean, I do what I do professionally, but, as a journalist as well, I like to think that I'm making a positive contribution to conversations and understanding. But yeah, I mean, the collective trauma on us all, it is immense. And then there's all the individual traumas as well that people have. So many people being bereaved, and that's itself one of the precursors potentially to suicidal ideation, having recently lost a loved one. And I mean, yeah, of course we are. But the flip side is that when Russia capitulates, when they realize that none of their intended military goals can be fulfilled in any way, shape, or form, because the Ukrainian army is just not going to stop. And it is better, it is stronger, it is better equipped. They have to capitulate. And the joy that we will, as a nation, feel, as a victorious nation, feel, it is going to go some way towards healing. And then I look forward as well to the rebuilding. But to get there, I saw a statement from the head of the armed forces yesterday, and he was saying that we need 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles. We need 500 main battle tanks. We need hundreds and hundreds of additional howitzers. The thing that many people don't get is just how big Ukraine is. This country is enormous, right? And so when people talk about sending in, I think we have 24 HIMARS at the moment, right? Something like that, right? But the territory under occupation and that needs to be liberated is vast. And, there are two ways that this war ends. One is with more support, including the provision, and Slovakia is talking about this right now, sending in their MiG squadron that they have, that will be donated to Ukraine, manned by Ukrainians, flown by Ukrainians, maintained by Ukrainians. But there's two ways that the war ends. It ends faster with more military support, or it ends slower with a higher ultimate cost. And those are the only two scenarios. Yeah. There isn't another one. There isn't a middle ground of ceding ground and ceding territory and abandoning people. There is no path whatsoever. This is the next article that I want to write, and I might try to get round to doing this in the coming days. There is no path for a Russian military victory at all. It simply does not exist. And the faster that the Russians realize that's when they come to that understanding, that's capitulation and the deoccupation of all of our territories. And like I said, it happens faster with more aid, or it happens slower with a higher cost.
And the price for accelerating it will be lives saved on both sides.
Lives saved on both sides. I was having a conversation with an American Ukrainian friend. He just messaged me yesterday out of the blue. In fact, he was back in Kiev for a few days, but we'd been together just before this phase of the war, right? We'd been together on an international march. We marched through the center of Kiev with our flags and banners, flags of all these different countries, showing like the international community of Ukraine supports Ukraine. And it was a lovely day. And there's a Ukrainian slogan which is Slava Nazi, glory to the nation, and the response to that is Smert vorogam, death to the enemy, right? And I had a conversation with my friend about this. Obviously, after the march, we went to a pub and we were sitting there and having a few drinks, right?
That's allowed.
Yeah, I'm partial to a Guinness. And I said to him, what do you make of this? And he said, they are occupiers. They are on our land. And death to the enemy is absolutely appropriate, right? I mean, you're right in what you say, that a quicker end to the war means fewer deaths on both sides. But the way that Ukrainians, and I consider myself Ukrainian. I've been here for 20 years. I got a huge Ukrainian tattoo on my side, right?
On your left butt cheek.
Not on my butt cheek, no, just here on the side of my chest. That's it. That's exactly the attitude. They are occupiers. They have come here to occupy illegally Ukrainian land and to torture Ukrainian people. And I'm sorry, but the attitude is, if you're here invading our land, trying to kill our troops, you are going to die in this country. And that's it.
Yeah.
And even with the conscripts, I've commented that actually the way that they're being treated by their own higher ups, those people who have been responsible for gutting the army, but through their theft and corruption, the fact that they're being sent into battle in the way that they are, underprepared, under-equipped, against a highly motivated and very well-equipped Ukrainian army, and a Ukrainian army that's morally on the right side of this, right? It is criminal. It is criminal. And that is when people are complaining about the lack of equipment for conscripts, that's how they should perceive it. It is criminal neglect to be sending your army in such poorly prepared conditions. But from our side, no. You are, whether you're a conscript, whether you're the Wagner group of mercenaries who have literally recruited people from prisons to send them into Ukraine and promise them, an immunity if they manage to go home alive. I mean, that's the level of moral degradation that we're fighting against, right? I mean, recruiting people from prisons to send them into Ukraine, right? But it doesn't matter to us, when I say us, I mean Ukrainians as a whole, but specifically to the military, of which dozens and dozens of my friends are fighting. It doesn't matter to us who they are. They're in our land, and they will be killed.
Yeah, and you can't feel sorry for them. You can't even think twice about that, not at all. But it would be great if you were equipped even quicker with more ammunition, more anti-aircraft missiles, etc., so this could be ended quicker. When we spoke initially on that Sunday, we were chatting about bearing arms, and I know you told me the story about your cleaner, and she was in and she saw, I don't know, something in your apartment, and she was more or less telling you if it came to it, she'd bear arms as well. Obviously, there was no need for that to happen. In Kyiv at the moment, is there conscripting going on? Are you seeing some of your fellow Ukrainians, are they being pulled in, or is the army, and is that it? Or how are numbers being replenished?
So let me, with the caveat, first of all, that I never believed that the Russians would come after Kiev. I was prepared. I went to the territorial defense. I wanted to sign up. I wanted to get trained. And the first time that I went was about 2 weeks before the 24th of February. And they rejected me as they just didn't want the optics of a foreigner, right?
It was a foreigner was the issue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was just a flat out, no, thank you very much, go away. And then on the 24th of February, encouraged by the girl I was dating at the time as well, I went back. I was so furious that day. I'm like, okay, I'll go and do whatever I can, right? And on the 24th of February, there was a wealth of riches at the disposal of the territorial defense. And on that day, they were saying, if you don't have military experience, we don't have a gun for you, go away, right? And it was what it was at the time. But the same situation as I saw at the recruiting center on the 24th of February, the defense minister talked about exactly that now. He said, and I saw this the other day as well, there are more people signing up for the army than they can actually train at the moment, right? And the defense minister said, I don't need more troops. I know what I've got. I'm certain that it's sufficient. But yeah, the numbers of people who are ready to fight, to continue to drive the Russians out, it is not surprising. It is not surprising. And again, Ukraine has a wealth of riches at its disposal of hugely patriotic and determined people, men and women, who are prepared to ultimately do whatever it takes so that Ukraine is victorious.
There's no comparison, Paul, is there? So on the Ukrainian side, you've got willing people, I'm going to fight for this cause, and you've got more than enough. On the Russian side, they're knocking on doors, tapping on your shoulder, saying, sorry, sunshine. Yeah, I know you don't want to, but you have to do your duty now for the country. Those two forces, there's no comparison. No comparison with that will and motivation and everything else. So life in Kyiv at the moment, how is it?
It's difficult, right? But it's difficult, but it's not unmanageable, right? So we have this schedule of rolling blackouts. So first thing on a Monday morning, I'll check the schedule both for my home and my office, and then I can work out where I can be at different parts of the day. During the Battle of Kiev, obviously supply lines were cut, and so going shopping, going to the supermarket then was like, there was nothing on the shelves, right? You would go to a couple of different shops and pick up what you could, right? But I can't say that there's normal life in Kiev, but we can go shopping. Restaurants work, and I tend to frequent them a lot. I have quite a few friends who are in the hospitality business and restaurateurs, and I know that they need support. They need custom. Their staff need to retain their jobs, and me doing that is me being a positive contributor to that sector of the economy as well. But all the time, you hear bits of grabbed conversations, people walking past you on your mobile phone, and they're asking like, "Do you have water?" Right? When I go for my guitar lessons, the first conversation that I have with my teacher is about what the circumstances are at home, and he's in a high-rise building with a young family, and when the light's out, the water can't be pumped up to his floor, so they can't bathe the baby, right? There's those kinds of practical issues that we have to deal with. But the war is all-consuming. And here's an interesting thing, right? Every single time we have one of these mass missile attacks, The very next day, the response of the Ukrainian people is to contribute more to crowdfunding projects that are supporting the Ukrainian army. It's just like, screw them. Here's some cash, right? And whatever can be done. And, Ukrainians have crowdfunded a satellite, right? So that we can get satellite imagery to a very sharp resolution of the enemy positions to be able to prepare for these HIMARS, extremely precise long-range missile strikes, We've crowdfunded the attacks that happened on the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol were done by naval drones, and we've crowdfunded, actually Estonia's crowdfunded a few of them as well, but we've crowdfunded for another few of those as well so that we can continue to degrade the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which will not be allowed to remain in Sevastopol after the liberation of Crimea, obviously. But that's the response. And while it is difficult and I've aged and so on, it is a privilege at the same time to be amongst these people and to be witnessing this. And, there's a lot in common actually between Ukraine and Ireland. One of the things is a wicked sense of humor. There's a friend of mine, someone who I've known from doing various TV appearances back in the day here before COVID happened. And she worked at one of the channels that used to invite me on from time to time. And, she often shares tweets saying, just a Ukrainian tweet, and she'll translate it. And some of the things that are written there are wickedly funny. But what do you do in such adverse conditions, right? That's what the Ukrainians are. They're fighters, and have been, if you know the country, the history of this country, have been for decades and indeed centuries.
I'm looking forward to visiting you, Paul, whenever we get the chance to. Tell me about these guitar lessons. Who do you want to be? Who's your guitar hero?
Well, I happen to know a few musicians, and I've always loved music. And around the time of COVID, I determined that I was going to finally get around to taking it up. And I bought my first acoustic guitar. That's now, it was the 7th of November, 2 years ago, that I took it up. My teacher and I had a break. He was on tour in Europe for a period. Then we had the Christmas holidays. And then with the beginning of this phase of the war, obviously we had other considerations. But in the last couple of months, I've taken the guitar up again. I'm playing Cat Stevens. There's a lovely song called Where Do the Children Play?
Okay.
That's one of the things that I like to play. There's a Shania Twain song, which is a lovely love song, Still the One. Quite enjoy it. It's a good piece of music, and I quite enjoy playing that too. And then there's the one that I'm now being forced to bar chords because I can't avoid the F in. There's a song called Me and Mr. Jones.
Yeah, I know that song.
Okay. I've been using the cheeky F major 7, but now Dima's got strict on me, and he said, no, you're going to bar these chords. You're going to play this properly.
Okay, so he's a nasty teacher as well as everything else, is he?
Do you know he's the perfect blend of patience because I started from zero, but carrot and stick. And sometimes I sit with him and it's a brutal lesson. And other times he's very complimentary. And, there's a couple of songs that I was playing. Richard Ashcroft, They Don't Own Me, and a song by James. James, formerly of the Verve, the James are a great band.
I love James.
Right.
So the best gigs I was at was a James gig, yeah.
Getting Away With It All Messed Up is another song that I learned to play as well, where I do the cheeky F major 7. But when I went to Dima's studio one day and he's like, right, I want you to play through those for me, blah, blah, blah. And each one, and I texted actually one of my musician friends who referred me to Dima as a teacher. And I said, Dima's just called one of my songs excellent and the other one perfect, which I know that neither were. But, you as a student, you need a confidence boost sometimes.
It's called encouragement. That's fantastic. Is Christmas a big deal in Ukraine, in Kyiv?
Yeah, it has been for years. There's been a shift since the Revolution of Dignity and aligning more with European norms to stop celebrating Christmas according to the old Orthodox calendar and to do it according to the European Christian calendar and celebrate it on December the 25th. I'm not feeling particularly Christmassy. I haven't put up a tree this year. But two stories of trees, a name of a city that everybody knows because of the horrors that were perpetuated when the Russians occupied it is Bucha. Everybody's heard of Bucha. And they put up their Christmas tree 4 days ago, I think I saw it, or 3 days ago. And the announcement simply said there was a poll amongst local residents. Did they want a Christmas tree or not? And the majority said yes. And so they have a Christmas tree, right? That's one story. No, there's two more stories. In Mariupol, in the south of Ukraine, which has been never occupied, but consistently hit by artillery and missiles, it's a port city. Sorry, Mykolaiv, excuse me, I misspoke. In Mykolaiv, they've created a Christmas tree which is made out of camouflage netting. That's their reality.
I like it.
And then I just saw something today, which is the head of Ukrainian Railways, who, if you haven't seen the Zelensky interview with David Letterman, you have to watch it. And he was one of the people who was also interviewed. And he's just so dedicated to keeping the Ukrainian train service, which has been, a vital artery for the country. And he's dedicated to keeping it running. And so he tweeted this morning that they've got a tree in the main train station in the center of Kiev, and they've hooked it up to a bike generator. And so it goes from the tree, which is lit up, and it pans around, and there's this dude pedaling on his bike like this. Again, I mean, that's what I said about the Ukrainian spirit and their incredible sense of humor. It's just like, okay, so yes, we have difficulties all around, right? But let's poll the residents and see if they want a tree. Yes, they do. Let's build a tree out of camouflage netting. Let's put a dynamo on a bike to power this one in the train station. Like, that's why I said it's a privilege to be witnessing these people just getting on with the most difficult of conditions.
And maybe for Paul, can you do your own little bit of fuck Putin and put your tree up? He's not going to rob that from you.
I saw from Kharkiv, actually, they put up their tree in an underground station. And the comment that came with that was, we won't let Putin rob our children of Christmas. And so it's a place that people can, families can take their kids to. I'm not a kid. I don't need the baubles and the lights. I'm not even sure what I'm going to do on Christmas Day, to be frank. I haven't made any plans, but I'll no doubt speak with my son, planning to send him some cash tomorrow so that he can go out with his mates and splash out a little bit on some clothes or something like that for himself. But yeah, my Christmas, I'll celebrate after the victory.
Yeah, I'd like to see you being with people that day. I don't know, is that stupid sentimentality or whatever? I'm not sure. But don't, like last Christmas you would have been with people, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I was.
Yeah.
And like I say, my son came up for New Year's, and New Year's is a holiday that's marked here in a big fashion. And so it was super having my son here then. But one of the other things that I'm going to do as soon as the capitulation comes and Ukraine is victorious and flights can be restored is I get on a plane and I go and spend some time with my boy. He's technically an adult now, but he's still my boy.
He's always your boy. Well,
yeah.
Do you know, we need to smile. You are on the Win Happy podcast after all, Paul. And I think without a doubt, and I know you're resilient, and I know, everyone is putting up the good fight there, and I know the resolve will not be broken. But there is that bit of trauma going on as well. And, maybe you just need to protect yourself. And, and I know the work that you're doing with Lifeline Ukraine, it's all about that and keeping people resilient. So maybe that starts with you a little bit. Brother, I want to say thank you for the friendship this year. I think about you every day. I wait for your tweets. I get nervous if I see that you haven't tweeted for a few hours. Maybe there's a power strike or something. But please take it easy. And thank you until the next time we chat.
Greg, I thank you very much. And I tell you what I thank you for the most. It's always nice chatting to you, but it's so lovely to see. It's important for Ukrainians to see support from Ukraine coming from all corners, right? And whether that means you giving me this time to shine a light on our experiences, or you becoming more active as a pro-Ukrainian tweeter as well, which I've seen. It means a lot to people, and that's what I thank you for. I thank you for caring about what's happening in Ukraine.
We can't forget, and we can't just allow this to happen over and over, even if it does become a nuisance and destroy our lovely lives, and let us get on with thinking about Santa and all that kind of bullshit. But this is important. Paul, take it easy, man.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.